In the first week of November 1956, the Chancellor of the Exchequer of the United Kingdom did the maths. His name was Harold Macmillan. He was 62 years old, a conservative grandee with the rumpled bearing of a country squire and a mind sharpened by service in 2 world wars. He had been Chancellor for less than a year. The figures on his desk that week were the gold and dollar reserves of the Bank of England, and they were falling. Between 30th October and 2nd November, the bank had lost $45 million. By the end of that week, the loss was over $100 million. At the existing rate, the United Kingdom's hard currency reserves, which had stood at about $2.25 billion at the start of the crisis, would be exhausted before Christmas. The cause was not a market crash or a war in the conventional sense. The cause was a friend. For the previous fortnight, Britain, France, and Israel had been waging an undeclared war against Egypt. The Israelis had crossed the Sinai on 29th of October. The French and British had bombed Egyptian airfields starting on 30th October. By 5 November, British paratroopers were dropping on Port Said. The stated objective was to recapture the Suez Canal, which President Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt had nationalized that summer. The actual objective was to topple Nasser and restore the sense, fading since 1945, that the great European powers still set the tempo of events in the Middle East. The American president did not agree. Dwight D. Eisenhower had not been consulted in advance. Anthony Eden, the British Prime Minister, had judged that Eisenhower would publicly disapprove and privately accept. He had judged wrong. Eisenhower was furious. He thought the Anglo-French invasion was strategically foolish, morally indistinguishable from the Soviet invasion of Hungary that same week, and a gift to Nasser. He chose not to lecture his old comrade in arms. He chose to break him. The liver was the pound. Britain's currency was pegged to the dollar, but the peg required hard currency reserves to defend. The United States Treasury, under Secretary George Humphrey, controlled the largest single foreign holdings of British government sterling securities. Quietly, in the last week of October, the Treasury began selling them. The Bank of England, instructed to defend the parity, bought back its own debt at the cost of further reserve drain. By the first week of November, the bleeding had become visible in the daily figures Macmillan saw on his desk. Britain applied for an emergency loan from the International Monetary Fund. The IMF was, then as now, dominated by the United States. The American executive director made it clear that no loan would be approved and no further support given until British forces ceased fire and withdrew from Egypt. Humphrey himself, in a private message to Macmillan, was even more direct. "You will not get a dime from the US government until you have gotten out of Suez." Macmillan had been one of the most enthusiastic hawks of the invasion 2 weeks earlier. He had pressed Eden to act with force. He had threatened to resign if the cabinet hesitated. Now, looking at the reserves, he flipped completely. On 6 November, he told Eden that the country could not feed and fuel itself for more than a few weeks if the dollar drain continued. He threatened to resign again, this time unless Eden ordered an immediate ceasefire. Eden ordered the ceasefire that night. The British landings had started 8 hours earlier. The full Anglo-French withdrawal was completed by 20th December. Eden resigned the prime ministership on 9 January 1957, citing health. He never returned to public life. Macmillan, who had been first in and first out, became prime minister the following day. What had Eisenhower demonstrated? That an American president could, without firing a shot or making a public threat, end the political career of a British prime minister and force the largest European empire still standing to reverse a war it had already begun. The lever was not the army, it was the bank. The lesson took 2 generations for Britain to absorb. Macmillan, having watched the lever pulled at his own expense, spent the rest of his career building a relationship with Washington, structured around the principle that Britain should never again be in a position to be levered. That meant the Polaris deal of 1962. That meant Suez onwards British foreign policy as a long bet on the special relationship. That meant Brexit, decades later, was framed by historians as the last full-throated assertion of an independence that had, in operational terms, been compromised in November 1956. France drew the opposite lesson. Charles de Gaulle, who returned to power in 1958, looked at what Eisenhower had done to Eden and concluded that France would never again be in a position to be disciplined like that. He pursued a sovereign nuclear deterrent. He withdrew France from NATO's military command structure in 1966. He was, in one sense, a creature of Suez. Two Allied choices made by the two men who watched. Macmillan accepted vassalage and made the most of it. De Gaulle refused vassalage and paid for the alternative. Both choices made sense at the time. Both have descendants today. On 28 April 2026, Friedrich Merz, the Chancellor of Germany, was interviewed about the American war on Iran. He said, in passing, "The Americans clearly have no strategy. And the problem with conflicts like this is always that you don't just have to go in, you also have to get out again." It was not a hostile remark. It was the kind of thing a German chancellor used to be able to say in public. Helmut Schmidt said worse things about Jimmy Carter. Konrad Adenauer used to call John Foster Dulles privately by names that did not translate. The President of the United States read it, and on 30 April announced that he would consider withdrawing American troops from Germany. On 1 May, his Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, ordered the withdrawal of approximately 5,000 soldiers, including a brigade combat team and a long-range fires battalion that had been scheduled to deploy to Germany later this year. The withdrawal will be completed within 6 to 12 months, leaving roughly 30,000 American troops still in the country. The President let it be known that he was considering similar withdrawals from Italy and Spain, both of which had been similarly unenthusiastic about the Iran war. The lever this time is not the pound, it is the legions. Since 1945, the American troop presence in Germany has been the foundational element of European security. It is what the German Bundeswehr is built around. It is what the rapid reinforcement plans of NATO's eastern flank assume. It is the thing the Russian General Staff models against. And it is the thing since 1990 that German chancellors have known they cannot easily replace. A withdrawal of 5,000 soldiers does not by itself change the strategic balance. But the message it sends is the message Eisenhower sent in November 1956. The deployment is not unconditional. The price of public criticism of American foreign policy by an ally on whose territory those soldiers sit is that they begin to leave. Mertz's choice now is the choice Macmillan and de Gaulle made in different ways 70 years ago. He can swallow his criticism, walk back the line, signal that the alliance is intact, and accept that Berlin's foreign policy autonomy is contingent on Washington's tolerance. Or he can look at the troops being put on aircraft and conclude that German strategy must be built around the assumption that Washington's protection is conditional and therefore must be supplemented or replaced. Both choices are difficult. Both have consequences that will outlast the current administrations on both sides of the Atlantic. The men who designed the post-1945 Western Alliance assumed that the United States would never use its leverage against an ally except in extremis. November 1956 was the first time the assumption was disproved. May 2026 is the latest. The space between these dates is the space in which the alliance was supposed to live. Last time, the lesson took two countries 70 years to absorb in different ways. This time, what comes next?